Hello, everybody. My name is Carol Abrams. I'm part of the Annie E. Casey Foundation Strategic Communications team. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. We'll be talking about research-based messaging about what young people need to avoid trouble as they navigate adolescence. Before I introduce today's presenter, let's talk for a moment about the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Next slide, please. The foundation develops solutions to build a brighter future for kids and families. Today, we'll talk about how to move people from seeing young people as deficits to parts of thriving communities, and also what creates healthy communities. Next slide, please. This final slide about the foundation makes the connection to today's webinar clear. We know that some young people face significant barriers to having the family connections, opportunity, and community that all young people need to become healthy adults. Many of you in the audience know these young people well. We want to drill down to the bottom of the slide and focus on prevention. That's why we asked thousands of people about what helps young people avoid trouble and where intervention should take place. That's the basis of what we'll be sharing today. The information is here for you. If it doesn't apply to you, you don't have to use it. The logistics for today. We welcome your questions at any time during today's presentation. Please use the Zoom's Q&A feature at the bottom. In the next day or so, we'll send all of the registrants a recording of the webinar, the slide deck, and a storytelling tool. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Hahn.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here today, and I'm so glad that you're with me. I'm really looking forward to discussing this topic, and I will take just a very brief second to introduce myself. So I am the Chief Client Officer at Fenton Communications, which is a social impact agency that works with nonprofits and foundations and probably many organizations like the ones that you all are a part of. And I have had a long career, dating myself a little, but more than 30 years in working in nonprofit communications. And a lot of that has been a focus on working in youth development and with child serving and family serving organizations, because this is a real passion of mine. I didn't put it on this slide, but it is also true that I am a mom of 2 young adults. So I went through the childhood and adolescent and teenage years and all that myself in my own home. So I bring that experience as well. But in my career, I direct opinion research and I work on branding and messaging and lots of different advocacy campaigns. And I help people use knowledge based from research, opinion research, to figure out where the public is so that we can be as successful as possible in leading the public where we would like them to go. And in this case, it is toward investing in and making sure that we can create bright futures for young people, that they have the obstacles removed so that they can do that for themselves. So that's a little bit about me. And now we're going to talk about why we're here today. So the goals for the webinar are to make sure that all of you understand what there is to know from this lens of public perception. What is it about the way that voters, adults, people who answered the survey, and they are a representative sample, what do they think are the issues? What do they think are the challenges that young people are facing? And then how can we reflect those in ways that lift them up? Right, asset-based frames and messages that are positively, framed around making the right kinds of opportunities for young people that we want them to have to thrive. And all of the things that we know that includes, whether that's guidance and connections to adults and all the different ways that so many of your organizations work with young people every day. And we want to help you understand how you and your groups might do more on the positive storytelling front, right? What can we learn? What can we say that would help counter some of the pervasive narratives out there about young people, which are not positive? And we will talk a little bit about that as well. So the agenda for the time we're going to spend together then is to do a brief grounding on what we've learned from some messaging research. And then we're going to talk about how that public perception around the way people see youth crime, youth getting into trouble, youth getting into, negative places where we don't want them to go. But what can we learn about how the public understands that so that we can talk about what's good for them and how we can create thriving youth, and how can we engage more stakeholders in conversations that are about the strengths of young people and not just the obstacles that young people face. And then I do hope to have, and we will have time at the end to take questions through the Q&A box, and we will try to get to some of them. So that's what we're going to cover. All right, so I'm going to talk about the research that we conducted and what we learned from it. And I do hope that some of you have ever had the opportunity to be a part of a research project, because it's very instructional and you really learn so much from people that you might not talk to every day. So that's why it's so useful to have this type of investment in opinion research done. So moving on, I'm going to talk a little bit about the objectives of the research and then the methodology. So what did we set out to want to learn? And then how did we conduct the research to ensure that that's what we would get? So the research objectives were to understand the current social perception around youth crime and violence, to define what the public thinks are the root causes of that, and to understand what does the public think would be effective or positively impactful in addressing this as a challenge. And then finally, how can we pinpoint precisely the types of messages that will resonate with the public? How can we drive awareness and create support? So there's many things that you could say about this topic. What can we learn about choosing the things to say that are going to presuppose people's willingness to support it, right? How can we open the right door so that folks want to be a part of the types of solutions that we want to bring to the challenge? And then the methodology is that this was a survey that was conducted online. It was in March of 2024, so it's just about 11 months old. And it is worth saying that I do not believe that if we conducted this study today, that the results would look very different. So there is always a lag in public opinion in terms of what's happening in the news and the environment and how long it takes to show up. But there have not been big national stories in the last year, I think, on this topic that probably would have swayed the outcomes. So I think this is still very, very relevant. We did oversample in the key cities where Casey has a presence, and it was a nationally representative sample of over 2,000 adults. So that means 18 or older, and it was demographically spread out, which means we made sure that we had what looks like a national balance for age and race, education level, income level, everything, whether or not you had children in your home. So this is a 2,000 sample that it was as balanced as we could make it for the national population. So that is the source of the information that I'm going to share with you. So I'm going to start with some key findings, and then I'm going to show you some data points why we can make these assumptions about what we learned. So here are some key findings. The first is that the public does believe that crime and violence among young people is on the rise. Now, that is not really the case, but that is what they think. There are some very isolated pockets in the country where there may have been, over the last few years, 2, 3, 4 years, small increases. But generally speaking, the prevalence of youth crime and violence is at a 20, 30-year low. So we have seen a significant reduction, but this has not, really pervaded public opinion yet. So people believe this, And we know that they believe this, and it's important. We have to know where they are if we're going to take them where we want them to go. The second thing that we learned, which is challenging from our perspective for the most part, is that people really do believe that punishment works. And this is a sticky mindset. People will say things like, well, if you correct the behavior in a really strong way when young people are still young, it's going to prevent them from getting into trouble later on. We know from data and research that that is not actually true as an outcome, but it is a belief. And this is a very important thing for us to understand. Another mistaken or misinformed perception is that we asked folks, what do you think is the greatest threat to young people's lives? And they said substance abuse. Now, substance use disorder is a big threat to young people, but it is far smaller a threat than violence, particularly from guns. We know that, for example, guns are the #1 killer of young people and children in the United States at this point, but this is not what the public believes, or at least not what this general swath of the public believe. And it may be that these are opinions that are influenced by media. And by that, I mean social media, news, papers, and online outlets, the radio they listen to, also the media they consume from entertainment. But these are perceptions that the public has. However, they also do believe in meeting the needs of young people. And I'm going to show you some examples of this. So when we ask people, well, what do you think they need? What helps young people grow up strong and healthy? They say, well, they need healthcare and they need caring adults in their lives and they need to feel like they belong. So they do recognize much of what we would like to see happen for them. But it is important to note that they want their concerns about crime and violence acknowledged. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because we have a different reality to share with some of the perceptions that are sticking in the public. So the public thinks youth crime, youth violence is rising, and we know that it is not statistically. But we can't start there. We can't start with a data argument that says you're wrong, because we won't get engagement. They won't listen. So we have ways of thinking about how to deal with this. And I'm going to speak about that later when I talk about the messages that we built based on the research. We also know that the public probably underestimates, they recognize, but not fully, how important growing up without your needs met really can be, and how that influences and shapes the experience of a young person. And we also do know that there is some generational difference. And this was interestingly the biggest distinction we found in our study. So the most likely demographic factor to show you how you see the topic of youth getting into trouble and what helps them could probably be understood through the lens of age. So the Zoomers and the millennials feel a little differently than the Gen Xers and the boomers. So that is one distinction that we did pick up. And this all falls under the key findings category. So now I'd like to go a little bit more into the data specifically. So Americans do believe, right, that greater rules and regulations would help. And we know this because we asked the question specifically. So we asked people, in your opinion, how can crime and violence among young people be prevented? And we got a range of answers, but the top 3 were these. We need different rules, regulations, and laws. That was the most popular opinion, and that was 40% of the respondents. But right after that came guidance and support at 36, which is a distinguishing difference, but not a large one. And then education comes in at 15. If you add these together, these were the top responses. And there were other ones, but they were so small that it's more important for us in terms of thinking about meeting the public to look at what the most popular and common responses would be. On the next slide, we talk about what would be effective in curbing crime and violence among young people. So we've asked people, what do you think is happening? And people have told us, we think it's getting worse. So we say to them, okay, well, How effective do you think these would be in making a difference? And in this case, we gave them lots of options. And these are the options in the way that they selected them. So you will see the number one answer conforms to the last question, right, about what would work the best. So by saying let people, young people face the consequences of attempting or committing a crime is consistent with what we heard about rules, regulations, and laws. There still is this very sticky belief that punishment works. So that's your number one answer. But very closely behind that, and lots of others, are many of the very interventions or the things that we believe also are the most effective ways to help young people. So meeting their basic needs, having more access to community resources, investing in third places, raising awareness about violence in schools. These are all responses, but you can see through this order that the kind of the strongest ones rise up to the top, but you still do see participation in some of these other beliefs. And I'm pointing out on the right side here that people who consider themselves civically engaged, and that's a self-reporting. And we ask people, you know, do you vote often? Are you involved in local politics? Do you volunteer? You know, we ask them a series of about a dozen questions that would define someone as civically engaged. So the people who said that they were are more likely than others to say that nearly every one of these would be very effective. That's useful to us because that tells us that the people that we are likely to encounter as advocates and in this space are already primed to believe that some of these things could be preventative measure. So we want to keep those with us as we go and we build a message platform, which we'll see a little bit later on. So I want to go to another data point, which looks at what they believe the impact could be of these preventative measures. And so we asked people that question. We said specifically, how much of a positive impact would the following preventive measures have on crime and violence among young people? And we got very strong answers from some of our most important interventions. So the number one answer, this is 2 out of every 3 adults saying that helping children develop social and emotional problem-solving skills and emotional regulation would be effective, would be a positive way to intervene. Youth employment, access to mental health services, 6 in 10 adults say that. Quality education, mentorship, development programs to strengthen employment, career readiness. These are all very high numbers, right? And violence interruption programs, support for basic needs, access to public benefits. You will see, you're now starting to see a distinction among popular answers. These are all enough to be considered. Anything above 40 is considered enough to be popular. But you can see how people are absorbing this type of information and what they think it would do for you. So on the next, I want to talk about the role of community leaders. And that's very important because this group here is most likely also a group of community leaders, people who are already interested and invested and working in or volunteering in or in some way connected to this space. So community leaders really matter here because when we asked everyone in the same way that you saw among the civically engaged, well, what do you think would have a major impact and how do you see yourself? Where do you fall? So the question on the right is the exact and precise question that we ask people. Please identify yourself. Are you a business owner, an executive? Are you a community leader, a religious leader? Are you a mentor? And what we learned is that the people who say that they are community leaders are much more likely to agree with us and that these types of interventions would have a major positive impact. So mental health services, mentorship, quality education, all the things that we really want for young people, community leaders, people who identify that way are saying, yes, we agree. We really think these things are important and we think that they will work. So that is very powerful and very useful information that we take away from this type of research. So in the next slide, I want to sum up what we learned by giving people a narrative and asking people, do you agree with this one or do you agree more with that one? And for those of you who've done an exercise like this, who have ever thought about it, a narrative is a little story that uses messaging, uses keywords, and sets up a vision of what it might look like and asks people, do you agree with this a little bit or do you agree with it a lot? So here is specifically a narrative that we gave people. And we said, there are two ways to think about this topic. There's Smith and then there's Jones. Do you agree with Smith? And this is what Smith says, right? Children and young adults today lack the discipline, guidance, and security that once kept violence in check. Young people always act out and they test limits, and today more of them are involved in fights, car theft, and other violence. For many of them, it's easy to access a gun for unlawful purposes. Certain communities are so riddled with problems that the kids don't stand a chance. With so many young people today struggling with their mental health and having their basic needs met, it's not surprising that they are involved in violence as both victims and perpetrators. Now, I recognize this is probably a really unpleasant narrative for a lot of us to hear, but we think it's important that we figure out what people believe. So we asked them, do you agree with Smith? And this is what they heard, exactly the way you heard it. Or on the next slide, we said, do you agree with Jones? Here's another way to think about this. Communities can protect young people from violence and criminal activity, particularly when they prioritize their needs. Research shows that positive and warm parent-youth relationships help children grow up healthy and with skills to succeed in school. Outside of parents, schools and mentors and youth programs that offer young people constructive activities like sports and arts and entertainment opportunities lead to reduced risks and better outcomes. Young people can thrive if adults and communities invest in them in their future. So we asked people, do you agree with Smith a little or a lot? Do you agree with Jones a little or a lot? And on the next slide, you'll see what they told us. So 46%, less than half, said, I kind of agree with Smith. 16%, yeah, I really agree with Smith, but twice as many say, I pretty much agree, something like that. But more people said they agreed with Jones. Again, it's a smaller number, but 17% said, yeah, just like that. But 37%, a bigger number, said, yeah, like that. I think I agree with that. And so what you'll see on the next one is we have a 0.8% lead, if you will, if you look at this, right? This tells us that we do not have everyone, but we do have a majority of people that believe that we can protect, that communities can protect young people from violence and crime through the things that they told us they think are important and work. Skill development, youth programs, employment opportunities, right? So this is a narrative that now has been tested, right? So we know that using these types of messages, and you're going to see them because I'm going to show you how they get implemented in a moment, that using this type of language is primed to already be met with some positivity, right? We cannot speak to everyone all the time. And my suggestion on, let's go back a slide to the contrasting messages. So we want to grow the blue bar, right? And we're going to grow the blue bar by taking people from the orange bar. We are not going to bang our heads against the 16% that say exactly like that, because chances are they are too hard to get at this point. But there's a big group, 30% of people, that we can, with more education, more outreach, more messaging, more storytelling, we can try to grow the support that we need. So thanks. All right, so let's go back to what we can do with all of this information. All right, to the next one, please. So we need to get the message to the public. As an expert who works in this field, what I take away from this type of information is that the public is inclined to support most of the preventative measures and interventions that we want to see happen and do more of. But they're not seeing enough of it to override the misperceptions. And again, we're not exactly sure. Misperceptions can come from so many places, but they are inclined if we can meet them with things that they already believe in. It also tells me that we really should be engaging community leaders and the civically engaged, right? But the community leaders, folks like you and the folks that you may be able to reach and bring on board, can be the positive influencers that we need to have. The research also tells us that with more concerted storytelling and with a greater effort of persuasion, that we might be able to neutralize and dilute some of the harmful assumptions that may be barriers to us making different types of policies or getting more help or getting more support for what we need. So when I say this, I mean to acknowledge that we cannot convert everyone and that we cannot argue with people to their face that they're wrong and we're right. But just simply putting more stories out there and appealing to people in ways that they are already implied that they believe, that they understand us, we should have greater influence. We should be able to build a stronger case. And we really need more people to be doing this, which is one of the reasons that the foundation is hosting this webinar today, and one of the reasons why I'm happy to share this content with you. So I've said we need to get the message out to the public. Now let's look at what that message really looks like. And before I get into that, I just want to do a super quick 101 for those of us who are not comms pros and do not think about this all day, every day. So let's talk about what messages are, just so that we're all on the same page, right? Messages are these very concise statements that communicate purpose, and they should convey information and emotion, and they should open the door so that people can come in and really be a part of your work. They are an entry point. They should convey your mission and your values, but they can be supported by data, but they're not data driven. So for example, if I say to you, we saw a 6% drop of youth crime last year, that is not a message. It's a data point, but it doesn't actually invite you into solving a problem with me, right? So strong messages frame the way you want it to be framed. They appeal to your emotions. They ensure consistency, and very strong communicators and organizations that have very strong communications, platforms repeat the same types of things often, because you need to be repetitive for people to hear you and for it to stick and remain with them. And we also need to have a very clear call to action. What's the purpose? Why are we here? And so we're going to specifically talk about that when we talk about the messages. So now that I've said what messages kind of are and what we hope they do, I also want to share with you that you can use them in almost every way. You don't have to have a communications in your title to do this, right? Communications uses messaging through everything. Through press releases, yes, and your website, yes, but social media and elevator pitches and media interviews and presentations that you give to the field. And when you sit next to someone at a community meeting and talk to them about what you care about and what you do. So having good and consistent messaging can be a part of all of our work, not just the ones that have it in their title. Okay, so let's get into the key messaging. What are we suggesting people say, and why are we suggesting that we use it this way? So I'm going to show you, the next slide is, forgive me, this is the most complicated slide that I'm going to show. I promise you it doesn't get worse than this. This is as hard as it is. But what I am trying to show is that there is a progression, that there is actually a framework to the construction of the messages that I'm going to share with you. And there's a good reason for doing this. So there's a discipline in developing messages, and this is the one that Casey has perfected and believes is effective. And I think it is too. You start with values. What's the issue at the core? What do we believe in? Why are we even talking about this? Why are we here? These are the big ideas that start with a capital letter, right? Then what's the opportunity for us to do better? What challenges do we have to overcome? What are the barriers? How are we meeting the challenges of the moment so that we're creating opportunities? What are the solutions? You never want to raise a problem without actually defining a solution, because then you just add to people's fear of overwhelm and chaos. And then lastly, what is the call to action? Who are we speaking to? What do we want that audience to do? And it can be as simple as learn more or visit our website, but it could also be, please consider this policy, or please think about the funding that we need in the community. Many, many ways to do that call to action. So VOSA is an acronym, VOSA, that stands for these key frameworks: building a message through values, opportunities, solutions, and actions. So now I'm going to get back to the simpler stuff, but thank you for hanging in with me because I wanted to share that. All right, so getting into values. I'm going to show you some messages. The bold statement at the top is the biggest message, the key message, the hopefully simple, most direct, directly born of the message research. This should look familiar to you because this came right out of that narrative test that we offered to 2,000 people. Young people can thrive if adults and communities invest in them and their futures. This is a big value statement. It is a vision statement. It conveys what we want to have happen, right? This is naming where we want to go. And all of these points underneath are messages that can be used as supporting points or talking points, talking about how we all benefit when caring adults can create opportunities, that youth need mentors and communities to help them stay on the right path, and that strong and safe communities are ones that support the healthy development and the well-being of youth, right? These are all values-based, big idea, should be able to be used by lots of different messengers and in lots of different environments. And mostly what I'm going to share with you today is that we're trying to keep these as big and as flexible as possible. For those of you who work in different specific sectors of youth development, you'll want to think about, how would these work for me? If I'm dealing with food insecurity or housing insecurity, then how could I use this to, be a part of the overall, narrative that I'm going to use? And for those that work on certainly diversion, youth development, child welfare, all of the fields, youth justice, these are primed for you. So these are the value statements. Now I'm going to move on and I'm going to talk about the opportunity statements. Young people who have seen or experienced violence, have mental health challenges, or who struggle to meet their basic needs are confronted with serious barriers to their healthy development. This is the way that we name what we think the challenges are, how we understand the obstacles to be putting in front of youth and what we want for them. And I want to make a point specifically about mental health and mental health care. It is a powerful thing for us in this way to talk about this because the public believes in it. I am not suggesting, I am not conflating kids who get into trouble or act up necessarily with those who need mental health care. I am not saying that having a mental health diagnosis makes young people any more, troublemaking or violent or any of those things. I am not implying that, and I do not believe that. But I do know two things. I do know that the last couple of years have really raised public awareness about the needs of youth and mental health. That is a message that has really been sticky. And we have, as a community, really been powerful with that. So now we have a public that believes that a lot of young people need mental health care that aren't getting it. And that is true. And so that is a useful thing for us to talk about. But there's other ways to talk about it too. Young people who are disconnected from their schools and have conflict with teachers and struggle with classwork are more likely to get into trouble. And if you live in a neighborhood where you're facing unstable housing and you're living in areas where your safety is not guaranteed, These are things that people also understand to be true. But what we're trying here is to talk about the needs of youth and the ways to support youth. We're trying always to do this asset-based framing, and we're going to talk more about that in a minute. But all of these key messages and the talking points underneath them are intended to make sure that we are making positive asset-framed statements. Okay, moving on to the ways that we see solutions. Communities can protect young people from violence and lawbreaking with positive preventive approaches that prioritize their needs. And here is messaging that brings in all of the data from that study that I just showed you. This is what we learned. Recreation programs and problem solving and helping helping families with their relationships, and school and arts programs, and recreation, and being connected to school and mentors and teachers. Here are all of the ways, all of the things that we know are good for young people, and the public also believes are good for young people and thinks will help them. So now, interestingly, I want to get to what's the ask? How do we get to that action statement? And so when we get to the action, I'm going to suggest, and this is on the next slide, that we actually have a way to address their key concern and belief, even if it is not statistically factual, right? So we can say to someone, if someone's if we think someone's already like, I'm signed up, I want to see all young people get everything they need, and I believe in the strength of young people, maybe you don't need to start this way. But for the majority of people, the more than 60% of people who are worried about crime and think it's on the rise, that the way to meet them and then talk about what to do is to say, you know what? If you're worried about crime, you be a part of the solution. There's so much the community can do to get kids on the right path. And then to talk about all of the things that we know, right? When we invest in them, we invest in their future. Let's get safe spaces so that kids can do this. Let's support parents because it's challenging. Let's help local communities offer more job opportunities or recreation programs or mentorship or whatever it is, right? By making a connection to say it's the communities and the adults who care about them. We can do something. You can be part of the solution for young people. And that's why it looks like that. On the next slide, I've showed you the way that you can kind of start conversations or lead people into these conversations by saying, can I talk to you about increasing access to services that we know are going to help young people manage their emotions and behavior? Or can we talk about what would be needed to get better and more mental health care to the young people in this community? How can we assure that our schools are safe and supportive? What can we do here to make sure that there are more jobs in the summer or after school, right? These are those kind of engagement questions that you could ask of other partners, local officials, community leaders, agencies in places that have budgets and have the ability to provide these things. Obviously donors too, right? Funders and donors too. So moving on to narrative development, because I've suggested that this is a platform that all of you can try to build from for your own contexts, right? I want to give you some instruction on what that might look like. How do you take all of this advice, right? The research and the messaging, and construct your narrative, what would be right for you? So acknowledge that the public thinks that this is a problem. I've said that a couple times already. I think it's important, or else you won't get past the belief, factor with people. Do you understand that people need to be educated about what communities can do? You want to leverage perhaps the fact if there are, as I said, people in their 20s and 30s and 40s versus maybe people 50 and up. You do want to focus on mental health and youth employment as preventative measures because A, they're good, and B, people believe that they're good. They think that they're good. And we do want to remember that the role of education, even if it's secondary for you, even if you're not a teacher or you're not connected to the public school, the context and the frame that people have around young people is always related to education. So it's important that you keep aware of that. And then finally, I want to say a couple things about framing and the power of using asset-based and people-first language. And we've tried as hard as we possibly could to model that in the examples that we've shown you. And I want to show you on the next slide that there's a way to think about this and what the difference is between language that you want to advance and language that you want to avoid, right? So we want to avoid the deficit framing, that it's the needs that drive, not the young person, right? It's the problems of the community, not the strength of it and the people in it, right? So deficit frames the things we want to avoid, calling young people at risk or vulnerable, or certainly on the JJ side, juvenile delinquent or even juvenile offender. I know that these are terms that are used in the legal system, but every time we repeat them when we don't have to, we're creating a negative frame and not an asset-based frame, and a lot of this work is informed by my wonderful colleague, Trabian Shorters, who I hope many of you are familiar with, has done great work on asset framing and talks about opportunity and strength-focused language. So it's talking about, for example, helping young people overcome obstacles and achieve their dreams, right? So if you must talk about the youth that we are concerned about, we can talk about them coming from places that are under-resourced or marginalized and not blame them for the very obstacles that they face, right? And to try to talk about young people who've gotten in trouble, young people in trouble with the law is also another way that we can do that. And when we bring this into the media and ways that other people can experience it, it can help us. It can help make the case. So on the next slide, I'm just showing you an example, and this is from, this is a little bit of a ringer here. I'm using David Muhammad, who's a huge leader in the youth justice space. But here's an example of an op-ed that was in the Baltimore Sun that he wrote. And you can see from the language that he's doing it in this strength-based and asset-based way. Lots of kids don't have the guidance that lets them make the same choice that I made, the choice to continue my education, which allowed me to learn and grow. It's too easy for youngsters to get lost forever after getting caught up in the criminal justice system, only to become adults with no future, right? He's really leaning into a personal story and talking about what the choices and the guidance and these types of things that opened up a future for him. And now he's a leader in the space, which is a wonderful thing. So I'm getting to the end of my presentation. I just want to make a call before I open the Q&A and invite you to put any questions that you may have in the Q&A box. The last slide is about the need for more voices in storytelling. And I said this at the beginning, and I'm repeating myself because I'm trying to model good behavior. But the reason I hope that you're here today and that you can use this is because you, everyone here, can be a messenger by using this information, following this guidance, sharing it with your colleagues, speaking up on behalf of young people. And to be realistic, we can't convince everyone to change their mind overnight, and we don't want to fight with the people who are super entrenched into their position yet. But we can really dilute the negative stories, and we can begin to tell a different narrative. We can begin to have greater impact with more powerful storytelling. People need to hear that these programs make a difference. They need to hear them from us. They very much need to hear them from young people. They need to hear them from teachers and students and lots more voices to shape this narrative. And I have pointed out before that we really want community leaders and people who are civically engaged. And I also want to say, yes, we still want a local business owner. Absolutely, we want clergy. Absolutely, we want people who are involved in the healthcare system and the education system as much as we can. So with that, I'm going to take a pause and take a breath and invite you to put your questions into the Q&A. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Jennifer. We really, really appreciated it. For those who are not recognizing the sound of my voice, I'm Carol Abrams on the communications team with the Annie E. Casey Foundation. I will be relaying audience questions to Jennifer, but first I will just say thank you and kick it off with this one, which is Once I feel like we need a little drum roll now. Um, how can we talk about this messaging without talking about race?
Okay, this is a good question. And I think it's interesting because in the research, we did not find very or even significantly different opinions based on race. So the types of things that people think are troubling, not a significant difference. The influences that would make a difference from a positive direction, prevention messaging, did not see a difference. What we understand from this is that what people think are challenges for all kids are for all kids, and what people believe are preventative for all kids. So in this case, there isn't a distinct difference.
Thank you. A question from an audience member. I've been trying to use asset-based language to highlight the program I fundraise for, but I've more often seen that ethos-driven and starkly negative language will resonate more with people. So I think you have gotten this question before because a lot of people really, really wonder the same thing.
So this is a good question, and it is probably true that many funders are still using pretty deficit-focused languages and negative pieces. I do not think that the way that you write a grant proposal is the same way that you would do a social media post or, a speaking, engagement in front of the community. So I think it's a little bit different. But I do want to say this. If you're trying to bridge that gap between they want to talk only about problems and I want to talk about assets, right? We want to talk about assets. One way to do it is to find common ground on the goal, the kind of the goals and the data that you seek, right? So you can say, for example, we know that only 1/3, of the eighth graders in our community are, meeting standards in math, in algebra right now. We need to invest in programs and the right types of teachers and curriculum that are going to help children achieve better academic outcomes, right? So you can find common ground on the problem of what's happening in terms of where you can point to data and need to see things change. What you don't want to do is say something like, we see children are underperforming in math, right? Because now you're blaming them for the problem rather than just saying we both share that we need to have a goal where we're rising young people's academic achievement. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Another question from a audience member. Can you speak to the role of data in these messages? What is the right amount of data to use in storytelling?
So, it depends on the length and the format of that story, right? Is it a social media post? Is it a 3-minute video? So there's a lot of different range of what you're going to do. But generally speaking, less is more. You want to use 1 or 2 really good, clear data points. You do not want to load people down with them. And you don't want to have to remember them yourself, and you don't want people to have to analyze data. You want to be able to make the simplest data argument for general mass communications as possible. This may change when you are writing a grant proposal. If you have an opportunity to brief a chief of staff of a local member of Congress, you may be able to sit down with them with a more complicated set of data. But generally speaking, for mass communications, you want to keep it simple and clear.
Thank you. I'm going to ask another, which is advice regarding the delicate balance between giving young people credit for their leadership and participation in research while protecting their anonymity. So obviously there are ethical considerations when we're using young people name and identity in things that could be contentious. Um, So if you could talk a little bit about confidentiality issues when it comes to young people telling their own stories or us telling stories about young people.
So this is a very good question, and it is a very real concern. It is very important that people hear the perspectives of young people from their own voice and in their own voice and telling their stories. It is also true that young people don't always consider the reach and the range of everyone who could potentially hear that. And as caring adults, we do need to be considerate of that and give them opportunities. I think we have suggestions about this. The foundation does a very good job of this. Very often we will use someone's first name and not their last name, or we will ask to use a different name and represent themselves under that if that's something that is important. We can also give them guidance and advice about how much of their story they need to share. But I do believe also in letting young people, be the star of their own story. We can just try to give them guidance and protect them so that they're never putting themselves in a position where they could be compromised. And most importantly, if they choose to share things that could be considered sensitive, that's for them. It's not for us to choose what we share on their behalf. I think that's where we have to be even more careful.
Another question. How do we target audiences to tell stories to so we're not preaching to the choir?
So this is a really great question, and I'll tell you why. We need to talk to people that we don't usually talk to, and we need to talk to the choir. And so many folks will have you believe that if you are preaching to the choir, that you are somehow wasting your time and energy. I don't believe that's true, because we need to keep those people with us. We need our choir. We can't lose the choir. So keeping in communication and giving them, modeling for them the types of things that they can also tell other people is building the bigger constituency. So we do need to use media, social media, public interactions to find, and I'm going to be really specific, like I want that light orange group. I want that 30% of people that kind of believed Smith, right? And I want them to come to more to believe Jones and believe us. So we do need through religious institutions, through civic engagements, through earned, owned, and paid media, all of these things. But I really want to say, talking and keeping your folks with you, your choir together, is not wasted. It's really important.
A related question, and you touched on it, but I'll ask the question anyway. Can you speak to crafting messaging for different audiences, a legislator audience, a business audience, and so forth?
Yes. So what, and it's a good question, especially because what you are looking at is pretty general. So all of those messages could work for really any audience, with maybe the exception of directly to young people themselves. I want to be very clear. These are not messages to talk to young people about young people. I think that's a different study, but I think they are of good general use. But in a practice such as mine, for people who do professional communications like I do, I would then take a message platform like this, and then I would develop specific messages for those audiences, business leaders, legislators, folks like that. And usually what changes is the ask. The value stays the same. The opportunities and challenges are probably pretty darn similar. The solutions might get a little bit more precise. So for example, if there were a specific program that you wanted funding for, then a solution message could be, please invest in Head Start, or please invest in X program, right? That could be something like that. But mostly it's the ask. When you get to the what can you do, that's where you get the greatest specialization of audience. So what you can ask of a funder versus what you can ask of a partner versus what you can ask of a youth mentor, right? Those are where you're going to see the greatest differences.
I'm going to ask a question about punishment. The question is, what's the best pivot from punishment and sort of moving that towards prevention?
I think that people instinctively understand that it is better to avoid the need for punishment and really invest in prevention. And so I think I would say to someone, when young people get into trouble, there are many different ways and different strategies to help get them back on track. But the best thing we can do is to avoid that situation in the first place. What can we do to make sure we're meeting young people's needs and giving them the opportunities that they need so that that doesn't happen?
Thank you. Everybody, I think we have had an absolutely informative, wonderful webinar. Please join me, even though I'm the only one with the microphone, in thanking Jennifer Hahn from Fenton. We will be sharing with all registrants the webinar recording, as well as the slide deck and a storytelling tool. And as you close down this webinar, you will have a survey that pops up, and that will help us gauge your interest, the audience's interest in further communications-oriented topics, be they storytelling or media-related. Thank you, thank you. And Jennifer, I thank you, and I am going to ask Raven to shut us down after a wonderfully productive afternoon.
Thank you so much.